We turn now to thinking about kind of a political thing as well, and that's thinking about the spread of Christianity in a colonial type of way. And so now we're getting into that time period where Christianity is spreading with the spreading of empires. And of course, within all of this, you've got to start with Christopher Columbus. Columbus was very deeply religious, very deeply Catholic. He's motivated by wealth, certainly, but he's also motivated with this idea of this last crusade. Right, the Middle East is unstable, and so let's take it back for the church. He sees his mission as spreading Christianity to the Far East as well. And that's evidenced in a document he compiles called the Book of Prophecies, which essentially is a journal of various prophecies from the Bible, from individuals. Joachim Fiore, who we mentioned last week, is an individual Columbus finds very interesting, and so Columbus has this kind of end times outlook as far as what he's doing, and it's not just about travels and routes to India, to China, the Far East. It's about spreading Christianity. It's about fulfilling these religious missions. He sees the world through a religious eyes, right? And the place where Columbus lands, right? He calls San Salvador, our Savior. And so there's this kind of mixture, as there was with a lot of these colonial expeditions, between this religious mission and the desire for wealth, the desire for power. The saying is that they came for God, glory, and gold, though not always in that order. Right? And so a lot of people came for a variety of reasons. Columbus was not very kind to Native Americans. Native Americans were not seen as equals. Essentially, Columbus goes with has the idea of, how can we Christianize them and exploit them economically? It's a very negative view of Native Americans, used Native Americans as slaves, shipped them over in pens, many of them dying, trying to get them back to Europe as slave labor. And these kind of actions help facilitate what becomes known as the Black Legend, this story of Catholic brutality, especially in colonies in the world. There were atrocities, and they were very violent and as Christians, despicable. But the Protestants snatch onto these and really elevate them, really kind of exploit them. And try to add on to what the Catholics are doing. And so there's, I don't want to say they didn't happen, they did, but the Black Legend becomes this way of Protestants taking these things and blowing them out of proportion, as if the Catholics are the only ones that commit atrocities. It's not Protestants, which was not true. I mean, the wars of religion involved a lot of atrocities. So there's this propaganda with this historical content, right? These things historically happened, but they become this tale that gets told about what happened. Native Americans did die from starvation, from forced labor. The conquest that Spain undertook was violent and bloody. But within all of this is that religious mission as well, and this is evidenced in the activity of Spanish Franciscans. The Spanish Franciscans, again, the Franciscans were an order of monastics here located in Spain, who came over with the conquistadors to teach the Native Americans, ostensibly teach the Native Americans about Christianity, convert them to Christianity. So you have this kind of combination of conquest and religious missions going on at the same time. And so the conquistadors and the Franciscans worked side by side. There's conquest occurring here, both physically and spiritually. The missions start very early, 1513. Ponce de Leon is exploring the Florida Peninsula. The priests brought to establish missions shortly after. Eventually, the Native Americans drive them off. St. Augustine is founded in 1556. as the base for Catholic missions in Florida. By 1620, there are 44 established missions. They eventually spread through the southwest United States, flourished there until 1630. There's a lot of rebellions. In the late 1600s, the Spanish recapture some of those lands, and so missions are reestablished all up the California coast as well. And so we see them in Mexico, Caribbean, South America. One of the most famous ones, at least visually, is the Alamo. And so here are these Spanish Franciscans, and it's the die-hard believers, the ones really committed to the Franciscan cause that become these missionaries. And the Franciscans had modeled their spirituality over St. Francis, right? This very important individual in the late Middle Ages, and followed a lot of his values, taking on this abject poverty, right? Really trying to live a life that was poor financially. And then also kind of rejecting a lot of society's trappings. Social order, very unimportant to the Franciscans, and believed that Christianity would be purified through living a very simple ascetic lifestyle, through disciplining the body, right, emphasizing the spiritual over the physical. But the other thing that also is coming out here is this generational conflict. A lot of the Franciscans emphasized youthful conversions, giving up your physical father for your spiritual father. And so the Franciscans become very influential in this missionary enterprise of Spain, and really influenced the strategies that were used. One of the strategies used, more from a political standpoint, was the practice of encomienda. Encomienda was a legal system that was for the colonization of the Americas. It served two purposes. First, it was to populate America with Spanish people. And second was to convert Native Americans. So essentially Spaniards were given large tracts of land in the Americas if they would do two things. First, move there, and then teach and try to convert the Native Americans that were living on that land. And so if you were going to take the land, you got the labor of all the Native Americans, but you had to promise to instruct Native Americans in the Catholic faith. Right? So you got the forced labor, but you're trying to save their souls. So essentially what we have in encomienda is kind of a system of slave labor with a religious rationale attached to it. What appears to be the case is that there was very minimal religious instruction that occurred by the people that took the Spanish Empire up on this offer. There were forced conversions. It was brutality, slavery, right? All those kind of things. Encomienda officially ended in 1542, but the system was so embedded that it was really impossible to get it out of the colonial enterprise. There were missionaries who participated in encomienda, those that were against it, but essentially this kind of conjoining of conquest and missionizing. The second part of the missionary strategy of the Spanish had to do with the missions themselves. The missions were essentially Spanish towns that were meant to order the life of Native Americans. The missions sought to bring Native Americans to a specific place. Encomienda just kind of took the land, and whatever Native Americans were on there, then instruct those. The missions was take these Native Americans and move them to these specific cities' missions. And in the missions, the goal was to make the natives Spanish. And so, like I said, the Alamo, for example. The missions used a lot of European styles, Spanish styles. They were town squares, villages, meant to look like Spain. They're importing Spanish culture. They're supporting Spanish language. The goal is to make the Native Americans Spanish. And they were forced into adopting European dress, food, and speech. Right? And so there are a lot of things that are going on that kind of force Native Americans to become Spanish, and by making them Spanish, they'll make them Christian as well as control the land that the Native Americans have. A couple of things became a part of the missions and the life of the missions. Missions turned Native American world upside down, destabilized it. For example, in what's now the Southwest United States, the Pueblo, the world was organized in this notion of center, right? And so the tribe often depicted in circular type of arrangement, and outside the circle, the periphery, divided the world. And so that's how you set up your villages. I mean, the center of the circle was important. It was holy, it was old, it was native. And there you practiced respect. That's where, the religious actors, people with spiritual status were. And it was there where you enacted respect and reciprocity, gift-giving, right? And so these relationships that developed outside were things that were unholy, foreign. That's where the violence was. And so those people within the tribe who were charged with, right, the chiefs, the warriors who were charged with battling those outside, they lived outside, the closer to the outsides of the tribe. The missions turned that concept on its head, in that the churches were often established in the center of tribal lands on top of shrines, the holy places. Right? And so it really inverted the whole idea of center and periphery. So the forces of chaos are now set up in the center of, the tribe. The other thing that it inverted was relationships between old and young. The Franciscans especially emphasized the importance of youth. And so in engaging the Native Americans, they favored the young peoples of the tribe. They gave gifts to the younger people of the tribe in order to put them into these obligations. Right? If I give a gift to you, you're obligated to return favor and a gift to me. And so the Franciscans did that in order to gain the favor of the youth. Essentially went about trying to humiliate the elders. And so if they would perform these morality plays or other type of religious plays, the young people would play angels, the good people in the play. The older would play the demons. They'd play, the villains in these plays. Another aspect of the Catholicism that's being used here is that it was very visual. It was using material objects and ceremonies as a way to communicate Catholicism, because the Franciscans and others that came with the Spanish were not interested in learning Native American languages. They wanted to make the native Spanish, and so because of the language barrier, they turned to visual means, objects, ceremonies, religious types of images, particularly the saints, right? In communicating those kind of things instead of sitting them down and teaching them theology. That wasn't the way they were going to communicate this. And so the theology that got presented was a very simple theology. It also ended up being often a very hybrid theology, as identifications were made between the saints, other holy Christian people, and the holy people of the native tribes. And so, there's this kind of connection between these kind of things. But what's also going on at the same time is a growing divide among even Franciscans over how to view Native Americans. Because there's a couple things that the missionaries were faced with, and Europeans in general were faced with. Some chose to ignore them, but others really attempted to try and address this. First of all was the question of where Native Americans came from. We're talking about a world where everything is shaped by the Bible. The Bible has all the answers for everything, matters of history and other aspects. And so the Bible doesn't talk about people in the Americas. It doesn't talk about the Americas at all. So who are these people? Where have they come from? And it ended up being that a lot of people then eventually came up with the idea that stuck for a while, that Native Americans were lost tribes of Israel. It became a very popular way to kind of think about, where had Native Americans come from? Well, we know from the Bible of the spreading of these lost tribes. Right? This is long before, there's any sort of anthropological theories and other types of things trying to explain Native Americans. So there's that. There's also kind of connected with the question of that is, some of the native practices seem to be very similar to Christian practices. So why is that? Well, some Europeans thought, well, maybe it is that an apostle had actually traveled here several centuries before, taught people of the Americas, and over time, those practices have gotten corrupted, and that's why we can see similarities by why there's differences. Other people think, no, what's going on here is that the devil is active in the Americas. And what the devil has done is make these imitations, these frauds of Christian practices. And so that's why they seem similar, is the devil has twisted these things around. Ultimately, one of the debates that develops occurs between a couple of individuals over some very important questions they felt needed to be addressed. Here's a new people. We have questions about where they came from, but what do we do about them? How do we understand these people? And are these people able to understand and become part of, understand the Christian message and become part of the Christian faith? And so do Native Americans have the capacity for faith? Well, people like Bartolomé de las Casas and Jacobo de Tessitera said, yes, Native Americans have the capacity for faith. Others like Juan de Sepulveda and Francisco Ruiz said, no, they don't have the capacity for faith. Ruiz argued that they're not capable of natural judgment. They're not capable of receiving faith. Sepulveda said, that Native Americans were born intellectually deficient. They were born to be slaves. They were mentally defective. Which led to another question, are they human? And of course, Las Casas and Testera said, absolutely, they're human. How could they be anything else? But Ruiz and Sepulveda said, no, they are not human beings. They needed to be enslaved, said Sepulveda, for their own good. It was the church's duty to enslave Native Americans. De las Casas, though, becomes a very prominent voice in trying to expose the actions of the conquistadors and other Europeans in all of this. He was a priest in Cuba, a chaplain of Cuba, and beginning in the early 1500s, he begins to, really think that some things are going on in the treatment of Native Americans that are inappropriate, that are sinful. He sees a chief who is captured, a Native American chief who is captured in a rebellion and sentenced to be burned alive. And Las Casas tries to have his life spared. Gives the chief a chance to convert, but the chief says no. And all of this makes a very deep impression on De las Casas. Eventually, the Pope steps in, Pope Paul III, and in a papal bull, a papal document known as Supplemus Deus, says Native Americans have the capacity for faith. They are human. They cannot be enslaved. This is not the way to approach Native Americans. Doesn't bring anything to an end. Priests are given the opportunity, the ability to kind of criticize the conquistadors. And there's some talk about persuasion of the Native Americans, but it doesn't completely get rid of all of those kind of things. I mean, there's still this colonial idea of, as Europeans, we know better than Native Americans, and looks upon the Native Americans as children. Some of them saw them as good children, some of them saw as bad children. But there's this rather complicated and oftentimes violent approach to the mission to the Americas.